Ngawang, Samten. Thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this special interview of Communism
You're most
Combat. Sir, I would like to begin by saying what is the essence of the Tibetan Buddhist struggle for dignity and human rights?
You mean Tibetan Buddhist struggle for dignity and?
Human rights.
Are you talking? Are you referring in the context of a social kind of system, or you are referring to the very principle of Tibetan Buddhism?
Both.
I see. I think there is an inbuilt kind of mechanism in Buddhism that every human being, or not even human being, every sentient being has the potential to be liberated, and every individual sentient being, even the animals and birds, even they have the potential to be liberated. So they have the right. So everybody has a right to be liberated. So this is a kind of very fundamental, basic principle that Buddhism has. And when you say Tibetan Buddhism, it refers, actually it is the tradition that came from India, mainly from Nalanda, Vikramashila and Takshashila. The Theravada Buddhism is confined to the South Asian kind of countries, and the Tibetan Buddhism is the system which came from Nalanda, Takshashila and Vikramashila, which had this practice of very holistic and comprehensive Buddhist studies and practices, which involved philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, logic, and a profound study of different other fields of studies. So this tradition itself has, as I said, a very strong kind of implication of looking at people and thinking themselves to have the right and liberty to be developed to the fullest extent.
And the political struggle, in the sense the political struggle of the Tibetan people, which is so linked to this notion of the Buddhist struggle for dignity, how was that able to cope against the might of a state?
I think, you see, the Tibetan struggle, which is completely in the form of non-violence, under the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we have been struggling in a very non-violent manner, and not having even a negative attitude towards our, the so-called enemy, China, but we treat them as a brother, and human brother and sisters, and that the mistake they have made is due to the ignorance of the leaders, starting from Mao Zedong itself, who had a very limited kind of understanding of human nature, limited understanding of the nature of the status of Tibet, and the social system at large. And because of that, I'm sorry that he led the whole, the nation of China into that kind of direction, which suffered a lot.
So hatred can be overcome not by hatred but by
absolutely
love.
Absolutely, and hatred has to be encountered through positive mentality, through patience, through compassion, through loving kindness. And if hatred is to be encountered by hatred, then it will enhance, the hatred will enhance, and there won't be any opportunity or chance of reducing the hatred.
So what is the significance of Sarnath, which is the location of the Central Institute of Tibetan Studies? What is the significance of Sarnath and Varanasi to Buddhism?
Sarnath is very important for Buddhism because Sarnath is the place where Buddha came from Bodh Gaya after his enlightenment and gave the first Dharma sermon, the first Dharma discourse on Four Noble Truths. And this is the first discourse in his life, which laid down the infrastructure for the entire teachings of his life. So Four Noble Truths. which is extremely important. That is why for Buddhists it is very important, and for the non-Buddhists also it is important. So far as Varanasi itself is concerned, I think at that time Buddha chose Sarnath because Varanasi, and even at that time, was a kind of a place where all the traditions of Indian spirituality used to be found, and great many masters used to be there, and great many practitioners of different traditions used to be there, and so it was a culture center right at that from that time. So therefore, even after the Buddha's discourse, and later after the demise of the Buddha, we can see that Varanasi had played a very prominent role in the development of Indian culture and the Indian academic and intellectual system.
So do not feel that today it's a conflict-ridden world where we talk about nuclear arms, we talk about war, we talk about violence. Don't you think there's an increasing responsibility on those with knowledge of religion and scriptures, those who have got the foresight and the wisdom of the faith, and also the rationality of the other world, to speak out against this violence?
Absolutely right, because it is the responsibility of the spiritual leaders, and it's a responsibility of those people who have by virtue of their practice, by virtue of their by virtue of gaining such knowledge in their spiritual tradition, have the responsibility to speak out and to reach to the people in order to reduce the intensity of the war atmosphere and the hatred atmosphere around the world. And to this, in this regard, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has, always been saying that the spiritual leaders must participate in social life. And they should come out to reach out to the people so that they can make some differences in bringing peace into society.
So your work on Buddhist philosophy, apart from everything else, on Nagarjuna.
Yes.
And would you like to say a few words about that?
I respect and I love Nagarjuna's philosophy very much, which is the Madhyamik, philosophy, which means the middle way philosophy. I find it very, very helpful and very profound, not only for my intellectual pursuit, but also for, for achieving peace in mind. Because after all, in Buddhism and according to Indian, spiritual and academic tradition in general, and particularly in Buddhist tradition, the philosophy is very much intertwined with the spiritual practice. So why we see, in my case, why I see Nagarjuna's philosophy so helpful is that there's nothing intrinsically, concrete out there. Everything is nominally and verbally designated. So we, common beings, get attached to, things as if they appear, intrinsically from outside. And that is why, and that is the very, very reason why we have a very strong reaction to the external world. If we understand that the external world is simply designated and verbally nominated, there's no substantial, concrete, independent status of those phenomena, then certainly our, approach to the world would be very different. So I find this extremely helpful.
It was very hurtful over the last year or two to see over the internet manifestations of violence and fascism within Buddhism, when we heard some monks in Myanmar on the Rohingya issue, or some other monks in Sri Lanka on the other minorities issue. Even a faith like Buddhism, that has stood for non-violence and rationality, has a tendency towards fascism and violence. How and why is that?
You see, I think, of course, it is very difficult for people to differentiate between Buddhism and person, the religion and person, the spiritual system and the person, because the Buddhism has always a very peaceful approach, And all the religions, I believe that I respect all the rest of the religions also have the same kind of approach and teachings. But when people act on bearing the name of taking the level of those different religions, and acting totally against the teachings of those religions, but common people cannot understand and cannot differentiate between these two, and they even keep on saying that this person is from Buddhism, this person is from blah blah blah, blah blah, and like that. So what we need to, if our people are more educated, then we can make them to distinguish between what Buddhism is and what the person is doing, right? If the person is wearing a robe and acting completely against contradictory to what Buddhism teaches, then the person cannot be called as a Buddhist, because whether a person is a Buddhist or not is whether he lives with those principles.
But sir, don't you think it has got something to do with the linkage between faith and power? Because when faith and political power get linked, there's a tendency in all faiths to turn into this violent majoritarian
Absolutely, that
way.
is again the same problem. You see, when the faith and there is attachment towards power, then so long as soon as there is a attachment towards power and obsession towards power, the spirituality is undermined.
Yeah.
So therefore you cannot call, or you cannot, no one can claim that somebody is a Buddhist if the person is totally obsessed with the obsession towards the power. Power acts contradictory to what the Buddhism teaches.
Would you then say that there's a very strong argument for a genuinely secular state?
Yes, I think, yes, certainly, yes. And again, the connotation of secular is very, has many, many phases, right? Yeah. Secular in the Western context and secular in Indian context, and India is not at all secular in the sense of not believing in religion, right?
But to be equidistant
Equally respecting the
and equidistant from all faiths in matters of power, matters of political power.
And in matters of power, for example, you see, I personally think Ashoka, he had complete respect towards every tradition of spirituality at that time, and he didn't have obsession towards his power, but he was utilizing the authority and the power for the service of the people, and that's something what we need to have, right?
Thank you so much, sir.
You're
This is
welcome.
wonderful.
You're welcome.